This video is about the use of lithium orotate for the treatment of anxiety, depression and bipolar disorder. I'll be reading out and answering some of the comments and questions I saw in my previous videos about lithium orotate. Quite a few people commented that they found lithium orotate helpful for their anxiety, so that would be a great place to start. At ObiKenobi1 said, "The thing I haven't understood is why lithium makes a good treatment for depression and bipolar disorder, while not anxiety. Since lithium provides neuroplasticity and growth of more synapses, wouldn't that also target an anxious brain? Anxiety can have the same detriments to the brain from inflammation and loss of neuroplasticity like the rest of the disorders, right?" The answer is actually no, they're quite different. Depression involves underfunctioning in some areas of the brain. In depression, there's a loss of synaptic connections in structures including the hippocampus, and the goal is to regrow these by boosting neuroplasticity. In this diagram, we have a normal state, depressed state, and treated state. In the normal state, at the end of the neuron, you have a good number of branches, and if we blow up this little area here on the side, we see what are called dendritic spines, a good number of them. Each one of those can make a synapse. In a depressed state, inflammation has pruned away the branches faster than they can be regrown, and the same with the dendritic spines, so that there is a net loss of synaptic connections. The good news is that if we reduce inflammation and boost neuroplasticity, it's possible to grow back the dendrite branches and the dendritic spines to form a lot of new synapses. This loss of dendrite branches and dendritic spines, resulting in a loss of synaptic connections, is a feature of depression, but this loss of synaptic connections is not a noted feature of anxiety disorders. Now, in both anxiety and depression, there can be imbalances in the neurotransmitters, but in depression it's going to be more dopamine or epinephrine or norepinephrine, serotonin or PEA, but the neurotransmitters involved in anxiety are GABA and serotonin. Now, lithium supplementation may help anxiety because of its effects on serotonin, possibly GABA as well. But lithium's ability to boost neuroplasticity is not really going to be that helpful for anxiety. Now, if you do find lithium orotate helpful for your anxiety, it would be worthwhile testing to see, is that primarily because it's affecting GABA or primarily because it's affecting serotonin, or a mixture of both. And you can test these effects by raising GABA in your brain with supplements like ashwagandha together with L-theanine and passion flower, and then you can test the effects of raising serotonin in your brain with supplements like 5-HTP together with saffron and zembrin, and then see how it affects you. I believe this type of real-world testing is actually better than laboratory testing. It tells us exactly how a person's going to respond to a treatment. So if you experienced improvements with either one of these combinations, then you would continue with that combination for several months, whilst also adding other supplements that boost neuroplasticity to stimulate the growth of either more GABA or serotonin synapses. It's a little complicated to explain, but when there's increased activity within the synapses, it stimulates the neuron they're attached to grow more neighboring synapses of the same type. More serotonin synapses for serotonin activity, more GABA synapses for increased GABA activity. So by upregulating serotonin or GABA activity, whilst at the same time boosting the overall neuroplasticity of the brain, this has the potential to stimulate the growth of more of the type of synapses we want. I myself did this very successfully. For some 15 years, I had to constantly top up my serotonin status by taking L-tryptophan. Although today I prefer 5-HTP because it bypasses the toxic pathway that tryptophan can go down in an inflamed brain. And that strategy enabled me to minimize my depression and basically scrape by. But when I added and combined lithium orotate with an additional stack of supplements and physical techniques to boost neuroplasticity, and in that stack there would have been saffron, zembrin, 5-HTP, probably magnolia bark, I don't remember, I believe I increased the number of serotonin carrying synapses in the frontal lobes of my brain. The evidence for this was that the short-temperedness, argumentativeness, and aggressivity that I had labored with my whole life as part of my bipolar disorder completely resolved. Well, almost. You see, low serotonin in the frontal lobes is associated with those psychological traits. Many people with bipolar disorder in particular suffer with this low serotonin activity in the frontal lobes and aggressivity. In addition to that, after 9 months on this treatment protocol, I never again experienced low serotonin depression, nor needed to supplement tryptophan or 5-HTP. And prior to that, I had to supplement tryptophan several days a week for 15 years. There's another thing about the differences between depression and anxiety and how lithium might fit in that I want to share with you. In my practice, I could see very clearly that anxiety disorders and mood disorders, that's depression and bipolar, would respond very differently to chemical treatments, whether it's a drug treatment or natural supplements. Depression and bipolar disorder respond really well, or can respond really well, to chemical treatments. The results can be very positive and also very long lasting. But anxiety, on the other hand, just doesn't respond in the same way. For sure, you can get some improvement and temporary relief from anxiety with supplements, but the results are rarely long lasting. It really feels like you're just sticking a band-aid on the problem. In pharmacology, anxiety is treated either with antidepressants to work on serotonin status or benzodiazepines to work on GABA status. Now look, it's not my place to advise anyone not to take any prescription medication, but I'll share with you I've seen so many people, I mean literally hundreds of people, that have suffered from devastating benzo withdrawal syndrome. Believe it or not, antidepressants actually have some positive effects on neuroplasticity. But benzos don't, and they rapidly start desensitizing your synapses to GABA. So when you discontinue benzos, GABA activity in the brain can plummet, and then the fear-detecting parts of the brain become hyperactive, producing horrendous anxiety and body symptoms, even akathisia or shaking. Now that is a situation whereby there's a physiological or chemical imbalance in the brain induced by the benzo drugs, a drug-induced recalibration of the synapses, and this requires a strong neuroplasticity boost to help regrow the depleted GABA receptors, repair the synapses, and grow brand new synapses that have never been exposed to a benzo drug. And lithium orotate would be a very helpful supplement for this treatment job. So because I was so disappointed with the effectiveness of supplement and herbal treatments for anxiety, about a decade ago, I started looking elsewhere for alternative and more effective treatment solutions. You've probably heard me say this before, and you'll hear me say it again. For far too long, psychiatric medicine has focused primarily on neurotransmitters, and we need to widen our understanding of what causes mental health problems. So if manipulating neurotransmitters is not an effective treatment for anxiety, then what is? Well, there's a totally different way of looking at mental health problems, which is to focus on how structures in the brain, and particularly neural networks or circuits, are functioning in mental illness. Developing treatments based on altering neural networks in the brain opens up a whole new and alternative treatment approach. And I'm now convinced that this is a more effective treatment strategy for anxiety spectrum disorders. So I'm now saying that to overcome anxiety requires some rewiring of neural circuits and alteration of the function of brain structures. And to do that, we have to do some brain training exercises. You can't simply take a pill for that, including, unfortunately, lithium orotate. In the anxiety treatments I do today, the rewiring of the brain is the sort of first phase. And then that has to be followed on with some psychological exposure and recalibration of the fear responses and triggers to reprogram the fear and anxiety connections within key structures of the brain involved in anxiety, most notably the amygdala, but also the hippocampus. Now, for sure, this rewiring and recalibrating of structures and circuits can also be really helpful for depression and bipolar disorder, but it's less of a priority compared to anxiety, where the rewiring of the brain is essential. So I'm saying in mood disorders, depression and bipolar, I believe treating inflammation and neuroplasticity take central roles, but in anxiety, rewiring overactive fear structures and circuits needs to be the central part of the treatment. There is for sure a lot of overlap, but it's really a question of emphasis. In mood disorders, I emphasize changing cellular physiology, and we can do this very effectively with supplements, drugs, and diet. In anxiety disorders, however, I believe we should emphasize recalibrating brain structures and neural networks with brain training exercises. Generally speaking, in depression, we want to reduce inflammation and stimulate the growth of new synapses and grow back lost volume in the hippocampus. However, generally in anxiety, you may actually want to thin out synaptic connections to reduce overactivity in the relevant circuits and structures. We want to, for example, reduce the size and reactivity of a structure called the amygdala, which is involved in triggering the anxiety or fear response. changing the amygdala requires brain training and psychological approaches, I believe using supplements and drugs is really just, at best, a temporary solution. In anxiety, brain scans have shown overactivity in one of the brain's major networks called the default mode network. Actually, the default mode network is also overactive in depression and bipolar disorder. So if you're struggling with a mood disorder, this next section is still relevant, but perhaps it takes up a more secondary position after the physiology. Very briefly, the default mode network runs from the amygdala, which kicks off with some scary, unpleasant feelings. The amygdala then connects to the hippocampus or memory banks of the brain to see if there's any matches to the distressing feelings, any scary, negative memory experiences. That information is processed in the back of the brain and then relayed forward into the frontal cortex or thinking part of the brain. And then we are aware of depressing, anxious thoughts and feelings. In a healthy brain, the default mode network would switch on for a short while to help us to process potential dangers and past experiences. And after we've had a short think about it, the default mode network would then switch off again. But in the brains of people with depression, bipolar, and especially anxiety, this circuit just loops and loops and loops so that we're like spinning our wheels and don't get any relief. The default mode network is switched off when another network called the TPN is switched on. And brain scans have shown that with enough meditation brain training, we can shift that balance so that we dial down or dampen down overactivity in the default mode network, dialing up activity in the TPN network. So this offers a whole new strategy for treating a mental health problem. If we regularly stimulate and exercise the TPN circuit, it grows bigger. It's the same as growing a muscle. You exercise it, it grows bigger. Then that counteracts this overactivity in the default mode network. And you can't say grow a muscle by just taking a pill. You have to actually do the training. And it's the same in the brain. There are no pills that you can swallow that do the same thing or replace actual exercise. If you'd like to learn how to do meditation brain training exercises, specifically developed to give the TPN the maximum stimulation and workout, I teach that technique in my online meditation classes. It's a 3-week training program. You can sign up for the first class from my Calendly link, calendly.com/PeterSmithUK. If you'd like to learn more about the whole treatment sequence I've developed for anxiety, including the brain training and then reprogramming the amygdala with the assistance of supplements or other substances, and then finally exposure therapy, I'll be discussing that whole thing in another video. Focusing more on depression now, many of you asked, is lithium orotate helpful for treatment-resistant depression? Well, potentially, definitely yes, along with other things. You see, it's been observed that in the worst cases of depression, suicidal depression and treatment-resistant depression, you find the highest levels of inflammation in the brain and the lowest levels of BDNF and neuroplasticity. Well, reducing inflammation and boosting neuroplasticity is what lithium does really well. I wouldn't use just lithium orotate on its own, I would combine it with other things. But combating the inflammation and boosting neuroplasticity should be the priority in the treatment. It might not be appropriate to even attempt to rebalance neurotransmitters. And that's not just because you wouldn't be able to fix the neurotransmitter levels in an inflamed and low neuroplasticity brain, but it's even worse than that with regard to serotonin. In an inflamed brain, there's elevated levels of an enzyme that converts the amino acid tryptophan away from serotonin production and down a different metabolic pathway to produce a toxic compound called quinolinic acid. And if you don't first eliminate the inflammation, adding more tryptophan to try to boost serotonin levels is not only going to fail to fix the problem, it may in fact make things worse. I've seen this quite often in my clinic. Many people have told me that when they tried tryptophan, it actually increased feelings of depression and anxiety, made their sleep worse, and produced a kind of foggy brain state. What's happening in this situation is the combination of inflammation and extra tryptophan is just increasing the production of toxic quinolinic acid in the brain. If you have this experience, it informs you that inflammation is a player in your brain and what the next steps in your treatment plan should be. Obviously, you stop taking the tryptophan. Now, you could potentially switch over to using 5-HT, but that's just a temporary solution. It's not really fixing the fundamental root cause. What you need to do is focus aggressively on tracking down and eradicating every source of inflammation from your body, including the digestive system, and don't forget that overactive stress responses ramp up inflammation in the body. So recalibrating your stress responses is part of that job. You know the expression, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. If you miss a single source of inflammation that's ramping up the production of inflammatory cytokines, you may not have success. In my video on bipolar mania, causes and solutions, there's a fairly long section in the middle about where inflammation comes from and how do we get rid of it, which you might find helpful even if you don't have bipolar mania. Okay, moving on. At MyAskCoolWorld 2806 said, when I feel myself slipping into depression, I start taking 5 milligrams of lithium in the morning and 10 milligrams at night, along with added supplements. I've been doing this for about a year and it never fails me. Always helps so much. After a couple of weeks of taking it, I taper off until I feel myself slip again. Well, to me, this pattern of recurrent relapsing depression indicates that your brain is not sustaining a healthy balance between your neuroplasticity versus the destructive wear and tear forces, including inflammation, oxidative stress, nitrosative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction, poor sleep, overactivation of your HPA axis resulting in elevated cortisol, GSK3, and waves of toxins from high neurotransmitter turnover. And I would approach this problem by optimizing your neuroprotection and repair systems, boosting your neuroplasticity, BDNF, and minimizing all sources of wear and tear. You see, it's now believed that depression is primarily a loss of synapses rather than a deficiency of neurotransmitters inside the synapses. When wear and tear and inflammation break down synaptic connections more quickly than your neuroplasticity can grow them back again, we end up with a net loss of synaptic connections in key structures of the brain that control mood, such as the hippocampus. I watched a great video on a YouTube channel called Zoe, where a professor was explaining that a junk food diet will actually cause the hippocampus to shrink, but then when you go on to a healthy diet, it grows back again, and shrinks and grows back again, and so forth. And shrinkage of the hippocampus is a feature of depression. What I would recommend with lithium is don't stop and start it, but rather take it continuously, maybe at a higher dose for the first 6 months. That could be, say, 10 or 15 milligrams, and then for maintenance you might drop down to 10 to 5 milligrams. But by taking it for a long period of time, and by long I mean say 2.5 years, together with other things, you could grow a large redundant surplus of synapses, to call it that, so that when you go through a period of stress or a late night or something like that and you lose some synaptic connections, there's still so many spare ones that you don't drop below the level of a loss of synaptic connections that triggers depression. I would also think about combining other things that boost neuroplasticity, depending on the type of depression you get, whether it's more serotonin or dopamine, but you're thinking about things like curcumin, luteolin, skullcap, bacopa, and don't forget a diet so high in polyphenols that you're literally bathing your brain every day in polyphenols, like 2 smoothies and a soup. Oh, and obligatory fish oils and magnesium. Oh, and the foundational supplements of omega-3 oils and magnesium. If you try that and it's effective, I'd love to hear how you get on. At Ivana or Ivanichev 6181 said, can you tell me please what dosage, if any, is helpful for major depressive disorder, especially anhedonia and a lack of energy, and what are the supplements you can use it with to enhance? Dosage wise, in my practice, I usually recommend 10 milligrams, sometimes up to 15, even 20, 25, 30 sometimes, depends on body weight, depends on the severity of the situation. For anhedonia, probably not more than 15, maybe just 10. Now, anhedonia type depression is a telltale sign of a lack of dopamine activity in the brain. Dopamine gives us drive and excitement about doing and trying things and new things. It runs the circuits involved in the pursuit of rewards and the possibility of something good or rewarding happening. When dopamine goes low, those circuits shut down, and then you have no joy or pleasure seeking, nothing to look forward to, just a sort of flat, low energy numbness. It's horrible. I once spent 5 years in a low dopamine anhedonia depression. Supplemental lithium would be a great thing to include in the mix, but you would also want to include dopamine boosting supplements such as rhodiola and possibly the amino acid precursors that dopamine is made from, called tyrosine and DLPA. But, hold your horses. Do not supplement dopamine boosters if you have bipolar disorder unless you have first put really robust anti-manic treatments supplements and other strategies in place to prevent the uptick in dopamine from flipping you up into mania. This would be a good time to say if you want my professional help on how to do that, or anything else in the area of using supplements and diets and natural self-help therapies for mental health problems. I do one-to-one consultations online. You can book an appointment from my calendar link. Just put calendly.com/Peter Smith UK into your web browser and you'll see my appointment schedule. Select a day, the times are shown in your time zone, go through the payment process. I look forward to meeting some of you and working together on your mental health problems. Quite a few people ask, does lithium orotate help recovery from antidepressants, what you would call antidepressant discontinuation syndrome? Last year here in the UK, it was all over the news that a new study showed that perhaps as many as 30% of people suffer from discontinuation syndrome when they give up antidepressants. Now, just to be clear, antidepressant discontinuation syndrome is not just a return of the original depression. It's a collection of new symptoms that you didn't have before you took the antidepressants. It's clearly attributable to the use of the antidepressants. If that's true, that 30% of people that give up antidepressants can suffer this, that's potentially an epidemic, or actually a pandemic, because of the huge number of people that take antidepressants across the world, and especially in the US. Actually, I didn't look in details at the number. This 30% of people that will suffer from some antidepressant discontinuation syndrome might include some very mild symptoms that are transient and only last a few months. My guess is there's only going to be a much smaller percentage that suffer from really severe and also long-lasting chronic discontinuation symptoms. Whatever those numbers turn out to be, to answer the question, would lithium be helpful in such a situation, the answer is a definite yes. By upregulating neuroplasticity, lithium would assist the brain in recalibrating its sensitivity to serotonin in the synapses that had their calibration altered by the antidepressants. The increased neuroplasticity would also stimulate the growth of brand new synapses that have never been exposed. And furthermore, by reducing inflammation and oxidative stress, lithium reduces the things that impede or slow down neuroplastic regeneration. One very unpleasant symptom of antidepressant discontinuation syndrome can be ongoing loss of sexual function, loss of sexual arousal and sensitivity in the genitals. And there's one particular supplement that seems to specifically target this particular issue, and that is saffron. So you would want to include saffron with the lithium and an additional stack of supplements to upregulate neuroplasticity, specifically boost neuroplasticity in serotonin systems. Run that treatment for many months and see if that solves the problem for you. If it doesn't, there's something is being missed. You see, the brain is just so amazing at repairing itself. I always think if the brain isn't repairing itself, what is holding it back? There probably is going to be something, some source of wear and tear or inflammation that's just taxing, so that the daily wear and tear on the brain basically uses up all your neuroplastic capability, and there's no surplus capacity to fix the backlog of damaged synapses from the antidepressants. If that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. Joey also asked, can you please chime in a bit on lithium dosage for depressed and manic states? That's a great question. The exact dosage would depend on the type of bipolar. Is it more bipolar type 1, bipolar type 2? How rapidly does a person cycle? And a various number of factors. But generally speaking, one would use a lower dose of, say, 10 milligrams a day during depression phases, and then increase this by 50 or 100% to 15 or 20 milligrams per day during manic phases. But it's also possible, at least in the beginning of treatment, that you might want to use higher doses during depression phases as well, just to kickstart the treatment. Another scenario where you would use continuous higher doses is if there is significant signs of impaired cognitive ability and declining cognitive ability, slow processing speed, failing memory, etc. In my practice, when I develop a bipolar prescription, I actually give 3 prescriptions. There will be a central one which is for day-to-day maintenance and prevention, a separate prescription which will have increased levels of lithium, other supplements, and then even additional new supplement included to have a strong anti-manic effect. and then a third prescription which includes some antidepressants and more moderate doses of anti-manic supplements for phases of depression. And the way you're supposed to do that is keep looking down the road to read the signs and symptoms that tell you that you've got a mania coming or a depression coming, and then change your prescription to match the phase that you're in. Or when you get really skilled, the phase that's just about to begin. One really important thing to understand about lithium is that it does tend to be fairly slow acting. So if you're entering into a manic phase, increasing lithium would be unlikely to have much of an immediate effect on that same day. The good news is that there are other supplements and drugs that have really rapid effects. Some of the amino acids I use against mania start producing sedative effects within an hour. That's as soon as they get into the brain. So although lithium has amazing mood stabilizing effects, these effects build up slowly with chronic long-term use over months and years. My personal experience was I could feel my bipolar disorder increasingly stabilize for about 2.5 years after I started taking lithium, before it eventually, I would say, the benefits kind of plateaued. And you keep taking it to keep the benefits. You don't stop once it's plateaued. Despite lithium being quite slow acting, whenever I would see signs of my mania coming, I would increase my lithium from, say, 10 milligrams to 15, sometimes 20. But I would also use some faster acting anti-manic supplements. At Vanessa Fernandez 4692 asks, can you diagnose bipolar by testing your lithium levels? Well, unfortunately, there are just no chemical laboratory tests to diagnose bipolar disorder. There are also no brain scans or other physical tests that can be used. It may seem old-fashioned, but a diagnosis of bipolar disorder is still based on interpreting the signs, the behavior, and the reported symptoms. An interesting point here is the significant difference between bipolar type 1 and bipolar type 2. If there's something good you could say about bipolar 1, that is, people will get a diagnosis quickly. The manias are so extreme that they're taken to hospital or a doctor is called, and once you've ruled out any other reason for the mania, such as drugs and so forth, then it has to be bipolar, and you get the diagnosis potentially within a week. Compared to bipolar type 2 that can take like a decade or more to get the right diagnosis, and during that time you might have gone through 5 to 8 different doctors and medical healthcare professionals. In my case, I didn't get the right diagnosis of bipolar type 2 with rapid cycling until I was in my mid-40s, but I'd actually been suffering from suicidal depression as early as 13. Something I would like to say is that we should use psychiatric labels and diagnosis just as starting points. You know, a diagnosis of bipolar 1 or bipolar 2 or bipolar not otherwise specified. This condition manifests quite differently in different people. Now, taking that as a starting point, what we want to work out, and what I do in my practice, is I will test different systems in someone. Like, what would be the consequence of, say, strongly attenuating dopamine? Was that a good effect or a bad effect? What's the effect of boosting dopamine? What's the effect of putting a combination together? What happens if we really emphasize the suppression of oxidative stress in somebody, or boosting BDNF? So although we don't have precise laboratory tests for these things, we can gradually work out what are the important players inside an individual bipolar brain by doing real-world testing and see how it feels. One of the few good things about a mental health problem is that when the treatment's working, you know it's working. There's nothing hidden. It's not like, say, hidden silent blood pressure where you may think you're fine, but actually the meter says you're high. Or blood sugar and cholesterol and so forth. You don't know you've got them. But with mental illness, if I'm depressed and I take something that's antidepressant, I know it's working. If I'm in a bipolar manic state and I take something that brings me out of it, I know it's working. Okay, that's it. If you like this type of content, subscribe for more. If you think I deserve it, give me a thumbs up, and I'd love to read your comments. Bye for now.